It is 1770. In the dust of Bengal, 10 million people are starving to death in one of the most brutal famines in human history. But 4,000 miles away, inside a plush, candlelit London boardroom, the executives of the East India Company are not sending food. They are pouring claret. Why? Because they just raised taxes on the dead and authorized a massive 12.5% dividend payout to their shareholders. This is not a story about a corrupt government. This is the story of the greatest corporate heist in human history. A $45 trillion wealth transfer executed by a company that built the exact blueprint Silicon Valley and Wall Street are using against you right now. You think you are a citizen of a sovereign nation. You think the person you voted for is the one who decides the value of your currency, the safety of your borders, and the laws that govern your Sunday mornings. But look at your phone. Look at your bank statement. Look at the terms and conditions you clicked accept on this morning without reading a single word. You are living in a world shaped by entities that possess no soul to be damned and no body to be kicked. Yet they hold the power of life and death over your lifestyle. You feel the weight of their decisions every time a too-big-to-fail institution gets a billion-dollar lifeline while your interest rates climb. You think this corporate shadow over your life is a modern invention of tech monopolies or hedge funds? It is not. It is a 400-year-old script. You are simply the latest generation to be processed by a machine that was built in a small office on Leadenhall Street in 1600. Before there was a Google, before there was a BlackRock, there was the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. To the history books, they are a footnote about the spice trade. To the forensic historian, they are the original sin of global finance. Now, let us open the case file on the corporate empire and reveal the shadow behind the success. The story begins not with a gunshot, but with the scratching of a quill. On December 31st, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a piece of parchment known as the Royal Charter. On the surface, it was a business license granted to 218 merchants. In reality, it was a license to operate entirely outside the reach of human morality. This charter granted them a 15-year monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. Let's translate that monopoly into the language of the street. It meant the company owned the horizon. If you wanted a grain of pepper, a scrap of silk, or a leaf of tea, you paid their toll. They didn't just enter a market. They became the market. They were the 17th century equivalent of an all-encompassing tech giant. Part logistics firm, part central bank, part sovereign state. At first, they played the part of the humble merchant. They were the middlemen, matching the tastes of London with the riches of the East. But as the gold began to pile up in their vaults, the company realized a fundamental, chilling truth of power. It is much cheaper to take than it is to buy. By the mid-1700s, the East India Company had undergone a terrifying metamorphosis. It had stopped being a business and started being an apex predator. Imagine a corporation today, let's say Amazon or Exxon, not just lobbying Congress, but literally replacing it. Imagine a CEO who doesn't just hire security guards, but commands a private army of 260,000 soldiers. To give you a sense of the scale, that was twice the size of the official British Army at the time. The company was a ghost that haunted two worlds. In London, it was a sophisticated investment vehicle for the aristocracy, paying out massive dividends that built the grand estates of England. The company insiders grew obscenely rich before the wealth even hit the broader economy, a textbook execution of the Cantillon effect. In India, it was a monster with iron teeth. They didn't have customers in the East. They had subjects. They didn't have competitors. They had targets for liquidation. The mechanism was simple, elegant, and utterly cold. They used the capital of the London elite to build a fleet of East Indiamen, ships that were essentially floating fortresses. They sailed to shores where they didn't ask for permission. They demanded concessions. They perfected sovereign arbitrage, playing local rulers against each other. They used a strategy of aggressive diplomacy, which is a polite way of saying they held a knife to the throat of kings, until the ink on the trade treaties was dry. You are paying for the legacy of that charter today. Every time a corporation claims personhood to avoid regulation, or uses its massive wealth to bypass the laws of the land, they are wielding the exact tools forged in 1600. The East India Company proved that if a balance sheet becomes large enough, it no longer has to follow the rules. It writes them. In the world of finance, there is a term for what happened next: the pivot. It is a clean, corporate word for a messy, violent reality. For 150 years, the East India Company was a buyer. They brought silver from Europe to trade for textiles and spices in India. But silver is heavy, and the margins were thinning. A liquidity crisis was quietly looming. In the boardrooms of London, the directors realized that the most expensive part of their business wasn't the ships or the warehouses. It was the purchase price of the goods themselves. So, they decided to stop paying. The smoking gun in this case isn't a literal weapon, though plenty were fired. It is a document dated August 12, 1765. In a sweltering tent outside the ruined city of Allahabad, a defeated Mughal emperor, Shah Alam II, signs a document he barely understands. Across the table sits not a king, not a general, but a corporate middle manager. His name is Robert Clive. The paper in front of them transfers something no corporation had ever owned before. Not land, not a port, an entire tax system. This treaty granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect land revenue for the massive provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Think about the sheer audacity of that for a moment. Sighed. Imagine if a private security firm defeated the IRS in a skirmish. and then forced Washington to sign over the right to collect your income tax. That is exactly what happened. A private corporation, answerable only to its shareholders in London, now held the power to walk into the homes of millions of Indian peasants and demand their harvest at the point of a bayonet. The mechanism of this scam was a closed loop of extraction, executed in 3 flawless steps. First, the company used its initial shareholder capital to hire and train a massive private army of local sepoys. They turned the local population into the very engine of their own subjugation. Second, they used that army to decapitate the local leadership and seize the tax office. Third, and here is the genius of the crime, they used the tax money they extracted from the Indian people to buy the exact same Indian goods, the silks, the calico, the saltpeter, that they then shipped back to London to sell for a 100% profit. Before 1765, the company had to bleed silver out of Britain to trade. After 1765, they didn't bring a single coin into the country. They were essentially stealing the product and charging the victim for the privilege of being robbed. In modern terms, it was a hostile takeover of an entire economy, funded entirely by the taxpayers of the country being conquered. Let's look at the forensic fact of the era. Between 1760 and 1800, the drain of wealth from India to Britain was astronomical. We aren't talking about a few chests of gold. We are talking about an estimated $45 trillion in today's value over the course of the company's reign. To visualize that scale, it is more than the combined GDP of the United States and China today. The man at the center of this, Robert Clive, was the archetypal corporate raider. He returned to England with a personal fortune of £234,000, a sum so vast in the 1760s that it could buy several English counties. He achieved total regulatory capture, buying a seat in Parliament to protect his monopoly from the very government meant to oversee him. During his 1773 corruption trial, Clive stood dripping in unimaginable wealth, facing down hypocritical politicians who secretly held his company's stock. He looked at his accusers and delivered his chilling, historical defense. By God, Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation. But the hustle extracts a fatal toll even from the hustler. Paranoia and severe opium addiction consumed Clive, leading to his suicide shortly after. It was a dark reminder that a ledger written in red eventually bleeds onto the accountant. Meanwhile, back in India, the company's management style was one of pure, unadulterated asset stripping. Because they were a corporation, they had no interest in the long-term health of the infrastructure, which, in this case, was the human beings living on the land. They replaced the ancient, flexible tax systems of the Mughals with a rigid, predatory structure. If the rains didn't come, the tax didn't change. If the crops failed, the company's collection agents still came for their cut. This was shareholder primacy, taken to its logical, lethal conclusion. In a normal government, if the people starve, the tax base disappears and the government fails. But the East India Company wasn't a government. It was a business with a short-term quarterly goal. They had a monopoly. They didn't need the people to be happy. They just needed the ledger to balance before the next ship sailed for London. You see the echoes of this every time a modern vulture fund buys a struggling hospital or a housing complex. They aren't there to provide healthcare or homes. They are there to strip the assets, squeeze the tenants for every cent of revenue, and exit before the building collapses. The East India Company simply executed that playbook on a continental scale. They had turned a subcontinent into a giant outdoor sweatshop. They had cracked the code of capitalism. They found a way to externalize all the suffering, while internalizing all the profits. But as any forensic accountant will tell you, a ledger that only shows growth on one side is a lie. Eventually, the debt of human misery becomes too heavy for even the largest corporation to carry. The mechanism was about to snap. The most dangerous thing about a corporation is that it has no heartbeat. It cannot feel the cold. It cannot feel hunger. And it certainly cannot feel guilt. It only feels the pulse of the ticker tape. By 1770, the East India Company had achieved the ultimate corporate dream: total market dominance over human survival. But then, the rains failed. In the Great Bengal famine of 1770, the bridge between profit and loss became a river of bodies. While 10 million people, a number roughly equivalent to the entire population of London and New York combined today, starved to death in the streets, the company's warehouses were bursting with grain. Under any sane government, the solution would be simple: release the grain, lower the taxes, save the tax base. But the company was a machine programmed for one thing: yield. Instead of providing relief, the company directors executed an act of pure fiduciary psychopathy. They raised the land tax to 60% to make up for the revenue lost from the people who had already died. They didn't see a humanitarian crisis. They saw a shortfall in the quarterly projections. As the dead piled up, the company's stock price in London actually rose. Imagine the scene. While Bengal was starving, a group of investors gathered in a candlelit room on Leadenhall Street. The directors announced the dividend: 12.5%. Glasses of claret were raised. Outside, carriage wheels rolled through the London mud. 6,000 miles away, the people who paid for that dividend were dying in the dirt. This is the forensic fact of the corporate soul. In the company's ledger, a human life was merely an externality. A death was simply a data point that hadn't been optimized yet. But even the most efficient parasite eventually kills its host. By 1857, the tension snapped. The Indian Rebellion, or the Great Mutiny, was not just a desperate war for sovereignty. In financial terms, it was a bloody, violent margin call. The company was catastrophically over-leveraged on human suffering, and the debt finally came due. The company's private army turned on its masters, and for a moment, the empire trembled. The company's response to its own failure was the original corporate bailout. When the smoke cleared in 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act. They realized the company was too big to fail, but far too toxic to continue. So, the British Crown stepped in. They took over the company's assets, the palaces, the armies, the spice routes, but they also absorbed its massive debts. Who paid that bill? Not the shareholders who had grown fat on Bengal's blood. Not the directors who had ignored the famine. The bill was handed to the British taxpayer and, in a final act of cruelty, to the Indian people themselves, who were forced to pay the purchase price for their own colonization. The company didn't go bankrupt. They executed the perfect exit strategy. They privatized the profits for 2 centuries and socialized the losses onto the public the second the trade went bad. Today, in 2026, you see the ghosts of Leadenhall Street everywhere. You see them when a pharmaceutical giant prioritizes patent duration over patient survival. You see them when algorithms treat your private data as a commodity to be strip-mined. The East India Company proved that if you wrap a conquest in the language of fiduciary duty, you can get away with anything. They taught the world that a corporation is the perfect mask for power. It allows a few men in a boardroom to commit crimes that would get a king beheaded, all while hiding behind the impenetrable shield of limited liability. We are still living in the era of the company. We have just traded the red coats for tailored suits and the bayonets for venture capital. The East India Company didn't just invent colonialism. It invented something far more durable. 1. Corporate sovereignty. Control the system that collects the value, and you never have to produce anything yourself ever again. So here is the uncomfortable question history leaves us with. If you had been a London investor in 1770 and someone offered you a guaranteed 12.5% dividend, funded by a distant colony you would never see, would you have said no? And today, as massive tech monopolies hold more capital and structural power than the East India Company ever did at its peak, ask yourself this. When the next major global crisis hits, whether it is an AI-driven market collapse or a sovereign debt failure, who is really going to bail who out? Will the US government bail out big tech? Or is BlackRock going to end up bailing out the Federal Reserve? Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.